All right, welcome everyone to our first plenary for APALA's 2021 convention. I'm really honored to be here. My name is Susan Lee. I've been a longtime APALA member with the LA chapter, and I'm also the first vice president of the API caucus for the Service Employees International Union, so with SEIU. I'm based out of Los Angeles with Local 721. So today I'm really excited because I'm here to have a conversation with these incredible leaders in labor to discuss what it means to be an API worker, talking about our identities and the way that we're grounded in Indigenous and Pacific Islander histories, looking at land dispossession, immigrant and refugee community stories of war and displacement, and really looking at this question in a way to be able to talk to this plenary to how do we figure out how to uplift ourselves, right? And look at the legacy of APIs fighting back against these systems that have held us back and really been the root of how we all came up. And so as we look to our first question, I want our panelists to be able to introduce themselves and answer. So let's take a look at our first question. Tell us about the history of the movements you are a part of, right? What legacy are you rooted in? And how are you continuing the legacy through the work that you're doing? Kent Long is the founding executive director of APALA, and he's the current director of the UCLA Labor Center. So Kent, tell us about your legacy.
Really appreciate the leadership that you have demonstrated within your union, SEIU, and within APALA nationally. This year enters the 30th anniversary of the founding of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And we are so proud of what this organization has accomplished over the past 3 decades. APALA is grounded in the struggles of the Asian and Pacific Islander workers' movement, not only in the past 3 decades, but indeed for the past 170 years, when Asians have been an integral part of the workforce in this country. APALA has led the fight to organize the unorganized, to recruit and train a new generation of Asian and Pacific Islander union organizers, and to forge labor and community partnerships that never before existed. My own roots were with the United Farm Workers of America, and as a boycott organizer. And I went on to become staff attorney for the Service Employees International Union at a time when our union was taking on some of the most powerful organizing campaigns involving immigrants, people of color, and women. So APALA has a very strong foundation of struggle, of organizing, of working for racial and economic justice. And as we enter the next 30 years, I know that that tradition will only continue.
All right, thank you, Kent. Let's go over to our next panelist, Lagaya. Lagaya, if you can tell us about your history and the legacy that you're rooted in and introduce yourself to our group.
Hello, my name is Lagaya Domingo, and I'm the Racial Justice and Education Director for SEIU Healthcare 1199 Northwest. And I am also a board member of the Asian Pacific American Labor Alliance. And I want to start with talking about the story of my father, Somi Domingo. 40 years ago, on June 1st, 1981, Somi Domingo and Jean Viernes were murdered in their union hall for their union activists as Filipino Americans fighting against the Marcos dictatorship in the Philippines, as well as fighting to democratize their union. They were standing up against the discrimination and intimidation that was happening in the Alaska salmon canneries. My mother also has been a union leader in the Cannery Workers Union, now the Inland Boatmen's Union. And my mother was one of very few women who were organizing and leading in the labor movement starting in the 1970s. And I've learned a lot from both of their stories about, first of all, what it means to be a person of color in the labor movement and what it means to be a woman. And I've learned a lot about why we have to stand up, that we can't do it alone, that we need to be collective in our leadership, but also that we have to stand up against racism, sexism, homophobia, etc., and how critical that is to the foundation and fabric of the organizing that I now do. To me, it's really important that we learn about the organizing that happened before us, to learn about how we can carry that forward into the organizing that we do every day, and not to make the same mistakes that happened before, and to also be informed by the history ahead of us.
All right, thanks, Ligaya, for sharing that with us. Let's go next to Annie.
Thank you. My name is Annie Lestari. I'm from Indonesia, but I'm currently working as a migrant domestic worker in Hong Kong in the past 20 years. And also I've been active at the movement of migrants regionally and internationally. Aside of the chairperson of International Migrants Alliance, I'm also the founder of the Association of Indonesian Migrant Workers, and also the current Regional Council for Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development. Well, in my family, no one was an activist. I am actually the first woman who became activist throughout my migration journey. But however, in my family, many of them were migrant workers in Malaysia and even in Middle East. So I'm not the first migrant workers generation. But when I moved into Hong Kong, and I also experienced exploitation, where I was actually underpaid, the night rest day. I was actually locked down inside my employer house, not allowed to even go out to meet people, and many other kind of ill treatment that I experienced in my first employment. It really taught me a lot that there is no other way to really overcome the situation, but to really change. And I want to transform myself from victim into a survivor and also advocate of migrants' rights. So after I ran away from my first job, I learned about the justice system, the legal rights of migrants, and also beyond that, even about the global rights, global issues of migrant workers. And since then, I became, I empower migrants, sharing my knowledge with others, organizing, but also wanting to really make sure that the new generation of migrants will not only earn money, but also to learn empowerment and fighting for their own rights. So thank you.
All right, thanks for sharing. Let's go ahead and go next to Pabitra.
Hey, my name is Pabitra Benjamin. I'm the executive director at Adhikar. Adhikar is a worker center and a community center based out of Woodside, Queens, New York, though we have expanded our work beyond New York City at this point. And as a worker center and a community center, we really work with those that are in low income industries, informal industries like domestic workers, nail salon workers, who also predominantly work with women, are a women-based center, but we serve folks of all genders. And as rooted in Adhikar, I think my legacy is for sure those that started Adhikar 15 years ago, which was Luna Ranjit and Norbada Chetri, who joined us soon after. But for my personal self, I think that my roots are in my family, as many have talked about. So for me, my grandfather was somebody who in Nepal grew up in a really small village in northeastern Nepal, and then came and really was the first person at a time when they weren't educating women, educated all of his children, including the women, really talked about equity and equality at a time that folks weren't talking about that. As somebody from the Dalit community, which is like a lower caste, or can be seen as untouchable community, talked about those issues and challenged those issues, which was, at this point, 60 years ago, at a time that wasn't happening. And for me, it's also my work is rooted in my mother's work. My mom was a waitress my whole life, and really seeing her struggle in terms of being a new immigrant, somebody that didn't speak English that well when she first got here, worked 2 jobs to really be able to see that struggle is why I do the work I do right now in terms of working with Nepali speaking immigrants and workers. But I think, you know, we are rooted in legacies and movement building in so many ways. And for me, it's really important to also pay respects to all those that come from the immigrant rights movement, the workers' rights movement, and really think about the Black and brown individuals and humans that have really formed where we are right now, where we can talk about issues like colonialism, intersectionality, and build the type of movements that we're building, both as worker centers, but also as communities that are more than just one issue. So for me, the roots are, of course, in my personal identity and where I come from, but also in terms of all those that have come before us to build the movements. And most importantly, right now, to the workers that we work with that have during the pandemic and before that and for all times really been the backbone of our society.
Thank you so much for that, Pavitra. Let's go next to, last but not least, let's hear from Annie, our last panelist, in terms of her legacy and what she's rooted in. Annie?
Hi, everyone. It's an honor to be among all of you tonight. I am not a union leader yet, but I am definitely a leader in my school as a teacher and just in my life. And, you know, I am a bit younger. I am a millennial, you know, in this union work, but I thought for the longest time as the daughter of immigrants that I was a perpetual foreigner. I was brand new to this country. My parents don't know English. That means I must make something of myself, and we're brand new to this country. And then when I was 13, I found out I was related to a man named Vincent Chin, who was murdered in 1982. He was murdered during an auto workers crisis in Detroit at the time by 2 white auto workers who thought he was Japanese at the time of a big crisis where Japanese companies were being blamed for the loss of American jobs. Just as with right now, COVID-19 is being blamed on to Asian Americans, you know, and Asians all over the world, and being, you know, we are being targeted right now. And I would have taken that as, you know, a case where my family was like, we were victims of a hate crime in our family. But then I saw documentary footage of my great auntie Lily Chin going all over the nation and saying, I want justice for my son, who built a huge foundation for the Asian American movement to happen here in America, and who brought together so many different groups in labor and racial solidarities in order to empower all of us. And, you know, that's the foundation in which APALA is now standing on. And I am so grateful to be amongst you all. And I realized from my great auntie Lily's story that it can't be just one person. But in her case, she was the person who made sure Vincent Chin's name was known. And it does take that person to tell their story every single day to say, this matters, my son's life matters, our lives matter. And you should care about us, and you should care about our conditions. So when I started teaching in 2011 in Chicago, I was really struggling with where my place in the world was and who I could be. And I was working at a non-union school that didn't have working conditions that allowed me to be a good teacher, or the learning conditions that my students could have to learn how to read and write and think critically. And the next year I saw 10,000 teachers, educators, all wearing red in the streets of Chicago. It was the Chicago Teachers Union strike. And I knew at that moment we could all make our own working conditions, the learning conditions of our students, and that we could fight for the schools that our students deserve. So I have fought for special education rights, for my students' rights back here in New York City, for my fellow Chinatown tenants, because we can build up people with one story, but it has to become all of our stories and all of us speaking up in order to make the change that we can make happen. I'm so grateful to be here. Thank you.
No, thank you. And thank you to all of our panelists for really sharing your stories. You know, oftentimes, whether you're a union or not yet union member, right, just like Annie said, it's really important for us to acknowledge that we're not just individuals walking through life, but that we're actually in a community with other API workers, and that our history, our legacies are oftentimes connected, just as Lagaya, Kent, Pavitra, and Annie talked about. They're connected to other people. They're connected to our families, our communities. And so I hope that folks can not really just learn, not only learn from these stories, but take inspiration and take movement, right? That you're not alone. And these are ways that we come from our histories to organize and to continue organizing moving forward. All right, let's move on to the second question. So to really be our full selves in the labor movement, we must ground ourselves in the complex and nuanced ways that our identities and our histories are shaped by capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, and imperialism. And so this brings me to ask our panelists here today, how does capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, right, and imperialism shape our lived conditions as API workers? And really, what does this mean for our strategy, right? When we look at organizing API workers, how does this help to inform that? So let's go ahead and go to our first panelist, Annie. So Annie, why don't you go ahead and share with us your story and what your thoughts are on this topic?
Yeah, thank you. When I came to Hong Kong, again, I was not activist at all. I'm just an ordinary migrant searching for a better life, hoping that I could save enough money to free my family from the debt because of the Asian financial crisis in 1997. But also I was hoping to go back to school, after some years of saving the money. So I did not really understand what what is capitalism is about and so forth. But when I experienced exploitation by the recruitment agencies, by employers, and then the fact that our own government do not care when we keep asking them for help, and it really triggered me like, what is this, what have we done wrong? And then when I learning organizing, I find the stories of Indonesian, Filipino, or even Nepali, or even other migrants in Asia are the same. It is all about the wages, economic rights. It is all about political rights, social rights, and our basic human rights. It's practically denied. Yeah, it's not only that we don't have it, but really it was intentionally denied from us. So then it really raised my curiosity, like, who really caused all of this problem? Why can't we be equal like others? Why don't we have right of mobility and right to change job, employment? And why don't we have equal payment like other workers? We do the same kind of job, but why we are paid less, and we face a lot of stigmatization and discrimination even during this COVID-19 pandemic. When you are brown, darker skin, then you are automatically categorized as somebody that vulnerable to as a spreader of COVID-19. So that kind of sentiment is really strong within migrants in Asia. You guys are living in the US where white are really the common, the dominant race. But here we are actually living among Asian ourselves. So it's very difficult to even digest all those experience. Like our migrants in Malaysia, who are also Malay, brown, colored people, but then yet they are being abused and exploited, even, human traffic and so forth. So after trying to understand all this, engaging in different conferences, and learning about the global capitalism, then I realized we are part of the workforce, treated as a workforce, a cheap labor, I can say slave for the global capitalism. There is currently 270 million migrants worldwide, and half of them are women. And yet there are also more than 60 to 70 million people who are falling under the asylum seeker and refugee and displaced people. If you combine the whole number, it is very huge population. I come from a fourth largest nation in the world, Indonesia, and the number of total migrants and refugees are still bigger than my own population back home. So, and these the people who are actually become the engine of the factories, of construction, of plantation, of caregiver, of any essential labor that is being denied and seen as an unskilled and unprofessional, and therefore we are paid very little because we are not recognized, because we are not falling into the professional kind of category. So through this kind of global exploitation of migrant labor, the labor of the refugee and asylum seeker per se, this is how they actually earn the super profit. Like most of the migrants are paid 1/3 of the local pay. So here in Asia, when the Hong Kong, like for example, receive 15,000, the migrant will only be paid like 5,000. So one employer can even hire 3, or one company can hire many, migrants workers, and then just few of the local, because our salary is so cheap. And then yet we are disposable. At any given time, we could be sent back home if we try to rebel or resist. And then after the contract ended, and the company or the employer can always say, I don't want to hire you anymore, and therefore you have no right to stay in that country. So we are really cheap, and yet made to be docile and disposable by this kind of global system. And we cannot even seek any justice from any government, because our own government is very compliant to this kind of system. They don't mind their people being treated this way. And for them, as long as they can have a job market abroad for the unemployed labor, then it's fine. As long as they can earn a lot of remittances from migrant labor, it's fine. So they will compromise any kind of human right violation and treatment against their own people. And despite the horror story, labor migration continued. They continue to export young people to work in different countries and regions, so they can export the unemployed population back home. But beyond that, they can also earn a lot of money from the remittances we send back home. So we subsidize. We are not cheap worker only, but we also subsidize our families back home, who's supposed to be the responsibility of our own government. We care at least one migrant, usually look after 3 to 5 people in the family. We subsidize the poor community, and therefore they can go to school, they can buy this and that, and the economy is running. So everything, everyone is happy, but except the migrant workers, because we have to suffer double, triple kind of exploitation, and we have to work overseas for 20, 30 years, sometimes our whole life. A lot of us even die in the migration journey. So this is the kind of price that we have to pay in order to survive. And this is what global capitalism means for us.
Right. Pabitra, did you have something that you wanted to add to that as well? I know that you have some experience in that as well, in these systems and how they create these classes of vulnerable displaced workers.
Yeah, I think if I could just flow off into my section from what Ini said, that would be great. So, for us, a lot of the Nepali-speaking workers, those from Nepal, the Nepali diaspora, whether it be Bhutan, Northern India, and other places, are migrant labor to a lot of different places, including Southeast Asia, East Asia, the Middle East. And a lot of the patterns we're seeing that are coming here into the US, which is one of the reasons that Adhikar started about 15 years ago. And when we're working with the Nepali-speaking community, I think we're seeing exactly what Eni's talking about in terms of the exploitation of workers here. Even though we have a different subsect of the type of folks that can get here, and we have different people making journeys in different ways, whether they're coming first through a student visa, or they're coming through a visa process, or they're actually coming through the migration patterns from the southern border. Folks are paying lots and lots of money because there is no economy in Nepal. And so because there's very limited, I don't want to say no economy, but very limited economy in Nepal, and folks are paying 10, 20, 30, 40, $50,000 and indebted to people then that are running schemes in the countries to be able to migrate. And so we're here in the US working with a lot of folks that have come here through a number of different pathways, whether they're asylum seekers or others, and really looking at the fact that folks come here expecting to see something different in the United States, expecting to feel something different. But we're working with a lot of folks that are also domestic trafficking victims, those that have faced very similar conditions to what Eni talked about, where they are being worked around the clock, being worked 24 hours a day, not being paid the full time, sometimes not being paid at all in some situations, to also just not as domestic workers or even nail salon workers being abused because they may not speak English or understand English. In some cases, not even read or fully speak Nepali if they're working for Nepali speaking people. We're seeing the same types of patterns of exploitation where it is, folks that are from different races, but also our own people who are exploiting others who don't understand how to work the systems here. And so for as a worker center, it's really important to break out of some of those systems of oppression by really supporting people as whole individuals, by really supporting people not just as workers and on their workers' rights case, but on their immigration cases, supporting people as whole individuals to find a living. Like with trafficking survivors, we're making sure that folks have rent, making sure that they can get on their feet, making sure that their emotional traumas are something that we are supportive of. And it's really important for us to provide healthcare for folks. So I think we're also trying to break out of the mold of understanding how we think about labor organizing or workers' rights organizing as only one dimensional, but to think about folks as whole individuals where we can talk about their immigration histories, where we can talk about their families, we can talk about if they're facing language justice issues. So in our organizing around different workers, whether it's domestic workers or nail salon workers, we've been able to pass and work with our coalition partners to pass things like the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights or the Nail Salon Workers Bill of Rights, so that we're looking at these broader human rights and rights of all workers, both in their labor rights, but also in their spectrum of working on immigrant rights to make sure that folks have status or workforce authorization, and those that are undocumented get things like the Excluded Workers Fund. So for us, it's that comprehensive understanding of how oppression doesn't just hit folks in one way, or colonialism doesn't just hit folks in one way, is like a really integral way of how we're then moving into that what we is, in hype terminology is intersectionality, but really looking at breaking out of those molds. And for us as also a center that really started to focus on women, we recognize that a lot of movement spaces, both in the Nepali speaking community, but also just generally are pretty patriarchally dominated. And so to say, we actually want to center women's voices. We actually want to center women workers in the movement. And we want to look at the unique ways in which women from informal sectors are impacted and oppressed, but also the ways in which women are power and the center of our movements, and really provide information so that we can uplift people's voices. And so for us, that notion of thinking about what's happening globally is really important to the work we're also doing locally here in the United States. So I think that will be it.
Yeah, it's so interesting, and I'm so glad that you all touched on this, right? To be able to bring the threads of what happens globally to how it impacts us domestically. And we're not even talking about just unions, we're talking about just workers, right, at this point. So Ligaya, let me ask you, does this show up in the same ways in union organizing and in your organizing, or how do some of these concepts manifest in the work that you do?
What is coming to mind for me is thinking about the work that we do in understanding our experiences as workers. And oftentimes, my experience has been in talking with unorganized workers as well as workers in unions. We're working to understand the situation that we are currently existing in. And so what we're familiar with is what's right in front of us, what our experience is. And our understanding about how it is connected to capitalism and these larger structures, we may not have had as much awareness of, particularly for global workers who I think are maybe a little more aware of it. Especially in the US context, easily we are really focused on what's right in front of us. And so in our work in organizing, a lot of the work that we do is identifying the issues that people have at work and helping them to understand that they're not isolated and alone in the experiences that we're having, that actually the experiences that we're having, other people are experiencing the same things. And it's connecting with each other over those shared experiences that really helps us to start to become more empowered. And so as we come to better understand our individual experiences, then we help folks understand, oh, that is connected to the system that we're existing within. And we often use the word capitalism per se, but we're talking about those structures. And I think we all need to better understand how capitalism is at play. At the end of the day, when I think about the why, we're experiencing disempowerment, oppression, all of those things, capitalism is at the root of it. And when I listen to the stories that I just heard, I think about how we have so much in common with workers around the world, but we stay so isolated in our individual contexts that we often don't see that commonality. And it's by us understanding the commonalities that we share and the system that we're fighting against together that I think we'll be able to build the most power for all workers, and we'll be able to ultimately experience more freedom and more power, because I think that that is ultimately what our goal is. Oftentimes we get really focused in, especially in union organizing, on the bread and butter issues of a wage increase or better benefits. But at the end of the day, we really have to be thinking about these larger structural issues and how we can resolve them by building more power with each other.
Absolutely. And I think that's why this panel is so important, for us to hear the different layers and the different ways that these things, capitalism, colonialism, patriarchy, imperialism, how all of these things have impacted us. Annie, let me ask you, have you seen similar types of things shape your lived conditions as an API worker? And what would you say is, what should our strategy be when we organize API workers based on your experience?
Yeah, so I primarily teach, students of color who come from everywhere, because a lot of international forces like pull people to New York City for various reasons. We have undocumented students and their families. We have just a variety of different issues, different languages, different cultures that we teach in our classrooms. And so, as I was listening to everyone speak, I was thinking about how we as organizers and workers and leaders, we have to think about the roles that we have in our own space, within our own work, with the people we serve, and then just the larger system as a whole. There's a reason why there's a huge critical race theory fight in the news right now, right? That people are trying to suppress education around colonialism and capitalism and racism in that fight. There's a lot of bigger issues there, and it's all in favor of not teaching ethnic studies and teaching people that capitalism is at the root of many of these issues, right? And it's up to us educators, at least in our classrooms, to make sure we know that history and we learn it, and we teach it to our students, and teach it in ways that are developmentally appropriate and matter for them. I've taught so many students who didn't even want to speak their own home language because they thought English was the way they were going to learn and get ahead, just like I did as a kid. And I had to be like, no, habla español, 你讲广东话，你的普通话很好. You have to speak your language, and you have to be rooted in where your family is from, and who your people are, and know your history. But then it's not enough to just be in that classroom space. You also have to know, you have to know what the students' families are going through. And that's what makes teachers excellent organizers. I don't know if you've ever heard of Teacher Canvas, but we can relate anything back to our school system, because everything's related to education, healthcare, immigration, the electoral races that we have. And we see on the ground that, our communities were hit hardest by COVID because there wasn't the treatment, there weren't the levels of access that other communities had. And a lot of our people of color were essential workers during this pandemic and were more exposed, right? And so using that experience to then advocate for things like Invest in Our New York and fighting for federal funding for healthcare for our students, and being part of movements that are not just within our union spaces, although I can talk about that in a second, but that help all of our the people that we work with and the workers united. In terms of our union stuff, you know, we teachers, like, we changed our whole profession in a week, right, in March 2020. And you know, I've given ad hoc counseling. We've provided resources for mental needs for, you know, for parents and families who needed unemployment insurance. And it's really up to all of us to listen and spend more time listening than saying it's about me. And that's how we make a movement that's not just about us. You know, it's justice is not just us. So, you know, when you said, Susan, earlier about how do we organize AAPI workers, part of it is learning our history. Part of it is listening to others around and creating a demand, because as Frederick Douglass said, power concedes nothing without a demand, and then fighting for that in ways that make sense, where people feel empowered. You know, I used to help run the special education committee in Chicago, as in the Chicago Teachers Union, and they tried to cut 500 special education positions. And what did we do? We got parents together, and parents would go into their schools, record how many minutes their students were already not getting in special education minutes. And instead of cutting positions, Chicago Public Schools actually had to add positions because we were not getting the services that our students needed, right? But that was the work of parents, educators, lawyers, researchers, other unions, and also, like, cross-union solidarity really needs to happen. The 2019 strike in Chicago was with SEIU and the Chicago Teachers Union, right? So we really need to make these movements happen by showing that we can win things together. We cannot do this alone. We have to have alliances of all different communities to have legitimacy, validation, and to show that, you know, we won't stop until we get it. There's a poster right above me that says, "Nothing about us without us is for us." And I think we really have to focus on listening to what people need, using those as our demands, and the us becomes so much bigger when we do that.
Wow, Annie, thank you so much for sharing. It's so important to hear how we went from global to, you know, individual in terms of how we not only educate ourselves, but those around us, right, to be able to organize and move our movements forward. You know, and I hear you talk about the importance of, you know, the role of educators within all of this as well, and kind of breaking down some of these concepts and making sure that we not only recognize the roots, but how they impact us and how we move forward together. And with that, it's kind of fitting because the next panelist I want to call up to answer this question was actually one of my professors in college who introduced me to APALA. So Kent, you know, how would you answer this question?
You know, Susan, capitalism, colonialism, and patriarchy have defined the history of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders within this country. And our collective struggle over many generations has been to push back on what Reverend Lawson calls plantation capitalism. Capitalism in this country has been grounded in the legacy of slavery and white supremacy, and it has been grounded in an international model of exploitation and colonialism, which has led many people from the Asia Pacific region to come to this country. So in many ways, APALA bridges all of these various movements and struggles. and the fact that 70% of Asians in America are immigrants means that our workforce and our community has deep relationships and deep connections to our native lands. So we are ideally suited to build global labor solidarity, whether it is to stand in solidarity with the people of Myanmar today struggling against a brutal military dictatorship, or the people of Okinawa who are opposing the US military base expansion there. And this is very much linked to the struggle within the United States for worker rights, for immigrant rights, for women's rights, and for liberation. So APALA is uniquely qualified to take on the global struggle for workers' rights, as well as to advance the struggle in this country for racial and economic justice.
All right, thank you so much, Ken. I don't know about y'all, but I'm ready to fight every capitalism, patriarchy, imperialism, colonialism. Let's do it, right? And I think that's why spaces like APALA is so important, because it allows us to bring all these different types of voices together for us to not only learn, but to be able to be in dialogue with each other and to figure out ways that we can collaborate and move forward together. Okay, so lastly, I'm really hoping that our panelists here today can give us some final remarks and really share with us, right, from the legacy that you've just told us about, from the strategies and advice that you've just given to us, what would your call to action be for our APALA convention attendees today? So Lagaya, let me go to you first. What would you want to share with folks? All right, so lastly, I just want you all to make final remarks, right? Because we've heard from all these panelists today, and we've heard their great stories, their legacies, their roots. We've heard some advice, some strategies from global to local. And so with this being our first panel that we just had, I'd be really interested to hear from our panelists to really talk about what would your call to action be for APALA convention attendees, right, in these next couple of days. So let's go to Kent first. Kent, what would you advise?
Susan, the APALA convention has always been a time for us to advance a call to action. And even though this is the first virtual convention in our history, we still want to encourage everybody participating at this year's convention to take the call to action seriously. You have received a book in the mail that celebrates the 30th anniversary of the founding of APALA, Asian American Workers Rising. This book celebrates extraordinary stories of leaders within this organization who have built the organization and who have fought for worker justice for the past 3 decades. And in following up from this convention, we really hope that you will consider hosting a chapter event to celebrate this new book and to not only engage some of the people featured in the book, but also to engage other local APALA leaders and members to share their stories and how we are all part of this tapestry of the Asian American working class movement in this country. In this time of anti-Asian hate and violence, it is critical for us to organize and to fight back, and to host a book event to activate your chapter and to build labor and community alliances is one of the ways that we can also push back against anti-Asian hate and to celebrate the rich legacy of APALA and of the Asian American working class.
Looking forward to getting my book, and I'll be there at the LA event too, Kent. So really looking forward to that. Absolutely, one of the best ways that we can fight, Asian hate in this time is to uplift our own stories and get our voices out there. So, Pavitra, what would you say your call to action would be for attendees watching today?
For me, I think for those many that come to the APALA convention or are part of APALA or from unions, and one of the things we've been working really hard with in our nail salon organizing is to bring union and worker centers together. I think there's some differences in how we approach the work, but also a lot of similarities, especially the workers who we are centering in our campaigns, in our services, and everything that we do. And I think that there is really a model in which we can create, in which worker centers like ours, which have a lot of cultural competency, language competency, and approach our work as a community center, can work with unions to be able to build broader workers' rights movements. So I would really encourage folks to really explore that and figure out how we build, not just as labor movements and community centers when campaigns come around, but how we really build for workers and how we really bring our leadership and our members together. And a part of that is also then encouraging those that can to really invest in the language justice work. I think especially for the APIA community, we work in so many different languages, and especially for new immigrant workers, that language competency is so important. And I feel like, especially when we're doing our work, we're not just translating into English and Spanish. We're translating to English, Spanish, Nepali, often other languages, 3 or 4 or 5 other languages. I don't know if you all have ever been to like a National Domestic Workers Alliance convening, but there's like 6 translations happening at once. And if we're ever really going to build workers' powers to its whole in today's age and in the United States right now and internationally, we really have to be able to have workers speak to one another. And that requires us to invest in the language competency and the language justice work overall. And last, I would say, just when we work on workers' rights, it has to be looking at workers as a whole, as us, as individuals, as families, as communities. And for us, that means fighting for immigrant rights and really centering immigrant rights. A lot of workers in the United States aren't documented, may have temporary protected status, have children that are DACA recipients. And now is a time in the United States where we really need to make some progress on immigrant rights. We're really close to being able to legalize essential workers, DACA recipients, temporary protected status holders, but also undocumented folks. And I feel like as unions, as workers' rights organizations, we have to center that people are able to have their documents to be able to work in this country legally in a way that protects their families and they're not afraid of deportation every day.
Thank you so much, Pavitra. I'm actually really glad to hear you uplift language justice. It's something that we in the SEIU API caucus always try to put at the forefront. And it's really unfortunate because unless you're in a lot of API spaces like APALA or like within the National Domestic Workers, like you talked about, we really don't see that oftentimes be brought up to the surface, right? So I'm really glad you talked about that. Up next, I want to hear from Annie. So Annie, if you can tell us, what would your call to action be for attendees today?
So I think with the slogan "Stop AAPI Hate," a lot of people have been wondering, what comes after this campaign to protect Asian Americans. And I think a lot of our campaigns can be very reaction-based, right? And so my call to action is around being visionary and proactive, right? What kinds of conditions will make it so that the people we serve and our fellow workers have what they need in order to thrive in their workplaces. So I'm thinking back to the fight that many education advocacy organizations, students, families, and educators here in New York City just had to fight for fully funded schools. Our schools have been defunded for decades, and finally, we're getting back $4.1 billion in New York City public schools. And that was a big visionary thing. We're not fighting for our sinks being fixed. We're not fighting for soap, right? We are fighting for those things, but where do we get those things? We get it from this larger vision. And so, as I said earlier, power concedes nothing without a demand. When my great auntie Lily Chin fought like hell for justice for my cousin Vincent Chin, she led with his story. She led with what he, who he was, and her grief in not being able to hold him in her arms and, feed him. It starts with a story. It builds up to a demand if we listen to each other. And with those demands, we can demand such a better future. Thank you again, everyone, for just being amazing.
All right, let's be visionary, am I right? So let's go next to Annie. Annie, what would your call to action be?
Well, I agree to all speakers about the language. So a lot of the issues and the documents we have are really mainly in English. And empowerment really begin with the kind of understanding where you will be able to access all those information and documents. So it's very important for any migrant movement or movement per se that involve various nationalities to really be mindful of the language issues. But the second, also learning from my own experience, I've been questioning, like, why we have to suffer so much just to achieve a dream, just to be a human, just to be treated equally like others. It really requires a study that we have to undergo for us to be able to understand the history, like what Ken has said. It's really a legacy of colonialism and now global capitalism. So we have to be willing to even go to the root causes of the problem for us to even understand where we are now, why we are suffering this kind of abuses, and then also from there, how we are going to strategize our advocacy campaign, education, and organizing. That really very important. Otherwise, most of the migrants movement that I see are really sometimes become very stressful and depressing, because they feel that they've been doing a lot on the ground. They've been doing a lot of legal assistance, rescue and so forth. But seems all those cases have become endless. So unless we understand the context where we are and why we are being exploited this harsh, then it will be really, really emotionally draining. We will be burnt out. And I think as an activist, it is our responsibility to take care of our physical and mental health. I think this is one of the big issue. And beyond that, also the question that I think everyone already raised: how to really strengthen our unity among the migrants, immigrant, refugee community. Where we are now and beyond that globally, it's very important in time of this pandemic. For example, we realize that the Asian hate in the US, in different part of the world, is really happening to all migrants, regardless of where you come from. As long as you're migrants, you are poor and you are being, you are the lowest in the society, then you will be treated worse and harshly. So that, and we have really no one to rely on. We don't have our government. Even the United Nations is not there to help us. So it's really important to rely to ourselves through the organization and through the self-help institution that we have. But beyond that, I think what I want to emphasize is really the power of solidarity. This is really the time that we have to learn to unite with other workers in different sector, trying to bridge the differences that we have, and also come up with more joint program cooperation that will unite of workers, regardless of sector, regardless of nationality. Because in time of pandemic like this, I can say migrant workers especially are really in the defenseless situation, and we can only rely to our local brother and sisters to really step on and take the responsibility of protecting the invisible community, the migrant workers community. So I think the migrant movement also has responsibility to outreach to the local workers, to the women, to the trade union, and other form of movement that is existing to communicate and explain our situation and also get them to our side. And again, as we talk about global capitalism, to also share our perspective that all of us, in the end of the day, are victim of the current global capitalism. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's exactly why the spaces like this are so important for us to strategize together and develop that vision so we can be in solidarity with one another. Last but not least, I want to ask Ligaya, our last panelist, with this last question right now, which is, what would your call to action be?
I'm thinking about that we have a long history of Asian Pacific Islander organizing, both here in the United States and globally. And I'm thinking about this panel title about legacy and thinking about the standard. There is a saying, sitting on the shoulders of giants. And I want to encourage our participants here at our convention to think about your own leadership journey, to think about the contribution that you want to make, and whose shoulders you stand on. and to think about, what is that legacy that you want to build upon to help to build a multiracial and global movement for workers' rights. I think that we have to think about leading in a different kind of way that is not inadvertently replicating all of the forms of oppression that are going on in our world, but leading in a way that is collective and anti-racist, and where we can really build collective power for all of us. So those are the questions that I encourage our participants to think about today.
All right, so if we put all of our panelists' call to actions together, right? We go from talking about how do we uplift our API stories with the upcoming books that we have, to contributing to stopping Asian hate. We talk about how do we be inclusive, right? How do we put that call out to be inclusive in our spaces, to not only look at language justice, but look at the impacts of our work and our labor, not just locally, but globally as well. And then we also talk about how do we strategize together, but in a way that's visionary, in a way that looks at how we develop our leadership and the legacy and the shoulders that we stand on, right? And make sure that we also take care of ourselves, like Annie said, because at the end of the day, we can't be leading a movement if we're not taking care of ourselves. And so if you put all these call to actions together, I really hope that y'all can take the insight that we've received with these panelists today and bring these legacies into the future, so that we can look to reimagining a new world, right? With this call to action that is not only just for convention, but beyond convention, into our union spaces, into our community spaces, into our friends and family spaces, and to be able to make an impact and a change in the world that we live in, not only for API workers, but for all the workers, right, in our country and globally as well. Thank you to all of our amazing panelists for taking the time to be able to share their insight. And we really hope that y'all will stay in touch so that we can continue to move forward in convention and be able to organize the best that we can and be the best leaders that we can be.